All righty. If everyone's ready, I am. I'm excited about today. There's some great work in this space of climate change and respiratory health. And as the Chicago Asthma Consortium, we have such interest in this topic because if we don't do something now, our respiratory health and everyone with asthma and without asthma is affected. So we're really excited to present this to you today, and we welcome everyone. We know that each of you probably has a different reason that you're here, and we thank you so much. For this part of the talk, we just ask that you mute your microphones and hide your video, but when we go to the question and answer, we would actually love to see your beautiful faces, so you can definitely show yourself on the video then, and we'll go from there. Can you go to the next slide, please, Asher? Thank you. So just a few housekeeping things. As we mentioned, the video and audio should be off when the presenters are presenting. There's a chat feature, so feel free to say hello to us and to each other if you haven't seen each other in a while. If you have a question for the presenter, feel free to put them within the chat feature, and so that our presenters can answer them during the Q&A, and I'll help moderate that if it gets kind of buried within there. And then at the end, we will ask if you're able to evaluate the webinar so we can learn what you liked most about it and what we could have done better. And so this will always help our next presentation so that we can give you what everybody needs from these educational seminars. All right, Asher, next slide, please. Thank you. If you have any technical difficulties, we know it's Friday and Zoom tends to act up with all of the updates. If you have any problems, you can ask Asher for help in the chat. He's one of the panelists here, and he also has provided his email. So it's asher@chicagoasthma.org. So if you encounter a technical difficulty or you can't hear or something's wrong, please do contact Asher, and you can do so on the chat by selecting his name. So today's schedule is I'm welcoming you all right now. So we got that checked off. And now we'll be introducing our first speaker, and she will be speaking for about 20 minutes. And then we'll have a short question and answer for her talk and what she's presented. And then the next speaker, Brian, he will then speak for another 20 minutes. And in the last 10 minutes, we'll have an opportunity to ask Brian questions, as well as any other questions that you might have thought of later. Next slide, please. So just a little bit and a plug-in for Chicago Asthma Consortium and what we do. We seek to improve the quality of life for those with asthma of all ages through advocacy, education, and collaboration. And we really try to bring together everyone from the medical and public health sector, business world, government agencies, community-based organizations and stakeholders, and individuals, whether they work with people that have asthma, do have asthma, or their children have asthma. And we like to raise awareness of various aspects that are important to ensure that we discuss to help us keep as healthy as we can from a respiratory standpoint and as an exposure standpoint, which is exactly why we're here today. We would love for you to be a member if you're not, because you can help us shape what we do next. Next slide, please. We also wanted to thank one of our annual partners, AstraZeneca. Pharmaceutical support is important to be able to bring education to everyone that we need to. And Carol Levin will be available via the chat feature during this talk as a representative of AstraZeneca. So thank you very much. We value and appreciate your ongoing partnership and support. Next slide, please. So let's get to it. This is our CIC Asthma Clinical Management Policy Forum, and today we're focusing on climate change and respiratory health. Our first presenter is Elena Grossman. She is the Program Director for the Building Resilience Against Climate Effects in Illinois, or BRACE Illinois project. The BRACE Illinois project is a partnership between the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health and the Illinois Department of Public Health to help prepare Illinois for the health effects from climate change. She is very interested in built environment and nature-based solutions to climate change and health communication strategies in climate and health equity. She is also creating a concentration in climate change, sustainability, and health for the UIC School of Public Health. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala, received her BA from Franklin and Marshall College, and her MPH from the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health. I welcome I'm Elena Grossman here today. If you can allow her to share slides.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just gonna get this into power slide mode. All right, here we go. Thank you for that introduction. And as Andrea mentioned, I'm going to be talking about climate change and health in Illinois, specifically focusing on the respiratory health effects, but I will discuss some of the other effects briefly. But before I do that, I always like to include Grover doing his famous near far routine. And I like to include this because I feel like he helps illustrate how we have a hard time connecting with what feels far away, right? When you're in a job interview and someone asks you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? We hate that question because it's so hard to imagine what we'll be doing in 5 years, let alone in the year 2100, which this map is showing the projected change in heavy precipitation events from this century to the next century. Most of us probably won't even be around in the next century. So it's really hard to connect with a lot of the climate change projections. What we do connect with are events that have happened, right? So these are a number of flooding events that have happened throughout Illinois in the last 10 years. We can see them, we can sympathize with them, we may be able to empathize with them. Events that are closer to us, we connect more with, but even events out west or in the south, whether they're wildfires or hurricanes, when we see the devastation, the destruction, the displacement, we can really understand that and we connect with it better. And there's data to support that. So the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications, they conduct perception surveys, I think once or twice every year. And I just pulled 2 questions that they asked. And one question that they always ask is, do you think climate change is happening? And almost 3/4 of the country think that it's happening. But when asked if it's harming them personally, less than half. And that's really important from a policy perspective, because if we don't think something is harming us personally, we're less likely to advocate for it. And the reality is that we know that carbon dioxide is directly impacting the temperature change, right? This temperature increase. And you see that direct relationship in this graph. This is looking at average annual temperature over time from 1880 to around 2010. And each year is represented by a bar that's compared to the average temperature over that time period. And then the black line shows the amount of carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere. And so you see that direct relationship of rising carbon dioxide concentration and rising temperatures. So what does that mean for Illinois? We can see that our climate is migrating south, right? So by the mid-century, end of century, it can be like Texas. Now, again, remember, I did say that we have a hard time connecting with the future. But some images like this one can be very powerful because you can actually see how Illinois might change. We're also seeing more extreme precipitation. This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's state climate information for Illinois. And here they're defining extreme precipitation as the number of events with precipitation greater than 2 inches. And you can see that around the decades of, or the years of 1990, you can see that we are only increasing in these extreme precipitation events. So what does that mean for health? Well, this is an infographic that we put together to share with our partners. Climate change is causing environmental changes. So what's that mean for Illinois? Increase heat waves, or more frequent and severe heat waves, more frequent and severe flooding events, more frequent and severe droughts, worsening air quality. And that leads to a number of health conditions. These are the health effects of most concern to Illinois, right? So you don't see hurricanes, you don't see wildfires, although wildfires are interesting. But this is what we've identified as of most concern to Illinois. So I'm going to briefly talk about all the health effects except for respiratory health, because I'm going to go into more detail about that one. In terms of flooding events, there are a number of public health implications that are connected to floods, right? We have increased exposure to mold, which can trigger respiratory health, which I'm going to talk about. There's also increased frequency, increased risk for death and injury in preparing for an event, during the actual event, and then cleaning up after the event. Most deaths actually happen in cars where people are trying to drive in flooded areas. There are waterborne disease, increased risk for waterborne diseases, where our drinking water can be contaminated because of flooding events. This is particularly of concern in Chicago as it relates to our combined sewer system, where both stormwater and sewage water, when there's an extreme event, they're combined in the same pipe when there's not extreme precipitation event, but when there is an extreme precipitation event, that can cause water to be intentionally dumped out into the Chicago River so it doesn't overwhelm the sewer system. And that can then, obviously, there's sewage water, so that can then potentially contaminate our drinking water. I intentionally left out mental health as its own, which I will talk about in a little bit, but for Illinois, it's connected to floods. Heat, that is the most direct relationship. So in rising temperatures leads to an increased risk of heat-related illness. This image is actually from the 1995 Chicago heat wave, where over 700 people died. It's still the most fatal of all heat waves in the United States. This is an image of a mass grave because the Cook County Coroner's Office was so overwhelmed with unclaimed bodies that they had to create a mass grave. So all the spectrum of heat-related illness, from heat rash, heat cramps, to the most fatal of heat stroke. Vector-borne diseases, again, increased risk for both tick-related and mosquito-related diseases. Essentially, it'll be a longer season, which you'll see that theme in respiratory health as well. Our falls are longer, our winters are warmer and shorter, our springs are earlier. That means there's a longer season for mosquitoes and ticks to be out there and biting people. And then finally, mental health. You know, I pulled this out separately because it is so important. It's connected to flooding events primarily, but you know, when you think of a flooding event, you think of a wildfire or a hurricane, the destruction and devastation of personal homes, of businesses, the displacement, whether it's for a couple hours or several weeks, maybe even years. It has really big impacts on our mental health. And the image that you're looking at is actually from an article where 12 years after Hurricane Katrina, mental health providers were still seeing cognitive disabilities in people impacted by the hurricane. But today I'm going to really focus on respiratory health and how climate change is worsening our air quality. Before that, I just wanted to provide a quick snapshot of Illinois asthma data. You all probably have a better understanding of Illinois asthma data, and this might even be a little outdated. But basically, it's important to understand what our baseline situation is. This is just for asthma. This doesn't even include other chronic respiratory health conditions and what that looks like. But all of these health effects, right, including respiratory health, they're going to be exacerbated by climate change. And so it's important to understand what's your baseline at, how many people will be impacted. Healthy lungs can be impacted too, but it's a much more concern for those who have a chronic respiratory health condition. Oops, sorry. And then it's also important to recognize that, you know, particularly with asthma, it's not equally distributed, right? We see higher rates of asthma in low income and communities of color. So how is climate change impacting air quality? Really, there are three main areas. I actually didn't include flooding here because that's more indoor air quality, and I'm talking about outdoor air quality right now. So higher concentration of ozone pollution, increase in PM, particulate matter 2.5 and from wildfires, and increase in allergens. So I'm going to go through each one of these. So ozone pollution. Ozone pollution is a chemical reaction of nitrogen dioxide, volatile organic compounds, heat, and sunlight. The key variable in that equation as it relates to climate change is heat. You have rising temperatures, which means you have higher concentration of ozone pollution. And ozone pollution is horrendous for anybody with a respiratory health condition, but and even for those with healthy lungs. We have longer allergy seasons. The image that you're looking at is a graph. It's looking at the change in the length of pollen season from 1995 to 2015. If we look at southern Wisconsin, where there's a circle of 15 days, we can use that as a proxy for northern Illinois. So the pollen season increased by 15 days over a 20-year time period. Obviously, that's detrimental for people with allergies, with people with asthma, for people with any respiratory health condition. Why is that happening? Again, it has to do with these rising temperatures, particularly warmer winters. So we have, again, shorter winters, warmer winters, earlier springs, longer falls. And that means that pollen producing plants are just blooming earlier and lasting longer. And so that leads to a longer season for allergens in the air. Wildfires. This is an interesting one. It was not until this past summer where air quality was really impacted by wildfires out west. Before, as Tom Skilling would always say, wildfires really just brought us really beautiful sunsets. But this past summer, we actually saw air quality alerts for those with chronic respiratory issues. And again, that is of most concern when it comes to climate change, those with existing conditions. So this is actually relatively new to the health effects for Illinois. This really wasn't an issue until this past summer. And as I mentioned with distribution of asthma, you would think that air quality is in the air, right? Like it shouldn't necessarily disproportionately impact certain people, but it does. This is a study looking at nitrogen dioxide, which is a pollution that's created essentially by burning fossil fuels. And it's looking at the year 2000, 2010. And basically the red shades are communities of color and how much pollution they are, how much more pollution is happening in their community versus communities that are not of color. And so you see in the year 2000, 2010, communities of color are exposed to more air pollution. And let's not forget that communities of color also have higher rates of asthma. We see this also in heat. Heat can also be a trigger for asthma. And this is actually San Francisco. And what they're looking at is actually it's census block level. On the left, it's proportion of residents living in poverty. And on the right, it's just a snapshot of a day in May of temperature. And the one that I always like to point out is this one census block, right? You see it surrounded by relatively wealthy other census blocks. And that one really stands out in terms of level of poverty. And then you look at the temperature and it's much warmer. A lot of it has to do with how they're designed, how they're built, access to green space. But, again, we see low-income communities being exposed to or being more susceptible to heat waves. So finally, I'd just like to, point out a couple policies that can help with public health systems to improve their ability to address climate change. First, there's the Climate and Health Protection Act, which was actually sponsored by Congresswoman Lauren Underwood. It was sponsored, or she proposed it in June of 2021. It's kind of standstill, but it actually gives more support, more financial support to the CDC Climate and Health Program, which provides grants to BRACE grantees. It would give them more money, so potentially providing more grant opportunities to other states, because right now there have been 18 grantees, now there are 11. So, not every state is receiving this opportunity to help prepare their state for the health effects from climate change. The Build Back Better Act, that has a ton of climate change efforts really addressing mitigation. So BRACE really focuses on adaptation. So the idea of climate change is happening, it's already happening, we already have effects, we got to do something to reduce those effects. Mitigation meaning let's reduce greenhouse gases to slow down climate change. Chicago is in the process of updating their climate action plan. There's a huge focus on equity. It's not done. This link, which I can share later via email, but it actually, they're looking for community members to inform, to provide show their priorities, show your community's priorities for the plan. So it's not final. The plan is not final. They do have an equity focus, and this would also do a lot to help address the health effects from climate change. And then finally, the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, they created a climate action plan for the Chicago region. It targets municipalities, and it provides a lot of support for municipalities to address climate change at a policy level at the super local level. I'm just going to leave this on this note, because Brian's really going to go into the policies around greenhouse gas emissions, but there are so many co-benefits as it relates to both our physical and mental health when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, I've highlighted air quality and asthma triggers as it relates to respiratory health, but there are so many other co-benefits if we try to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, I think, all right, I'm going to take a couple questions before we shift over to Brian.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic. And I'm just gonna, if you're okay with it, just put your email there. Is it egross5@uic.edu? So people can get that link if they're interested in getting involved with the approach that Chicago is taking to climate change, so you all can hear your voice come through that. That would be fantastic. Anyone have any questions for Lena Grossman at all? This was an amazing, I have some, but I'd like to open it up to everybody if they have some ideas. I'll ask one while people are unmuting themselves or putting on their video. I was really struck by how only 72%, I believe, of people really thought climate change was happening. So that means there's too large of a percentage that think that it might not be, which should be 100%. But even more startling is that so many people didn't feel like it was affecting them. That's really scary. Like, what do you think we can do to not only bridge the gap of people not even knowing that it exists, but that people feel that this is an everyone problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the one thing that I always turn to when that is asked is there's a climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, who's amazing. And if you Google her, you'll see her all over the internet. She always says we need to keep talking about it. We need to talk about it with our neighbors, with our friends, with our family, with our coworkers, and we keep talking about it. And, trying not to make it so divisive, and building relationships with people so that we can actually have those conversations. And there was also, I remember seeing, I think it was Ed Maybach, who does a lot of climate change communications work. And he said, there was a Republican strategist that once said, you say it again, and you say it again. And if you think you've said it too much, you say it again, and you just keep talking about it. And hopefully, that can have an impact. And, I think it's hard, because I think that the conversation should be shifted away from, do you think it's happening, to what are we going to do about it? And, that's the political question. Because politics is essentially taking a problem and debating solutions. And there's no debate about whether it's happening. And so, and the final thing that I'll say is that while it feels like 25% is a lot, there was also another study that it was another climate change communications study that came out that basically portrays America in six ways. And it's a spectrum of where they're at in terms of climate change. On the one end, you have it's a hoax, it's not happening. On the other end, you have, we're going to die soon, right? And then you have something in the middle. And what they say is that the majority of people are somewhere in the middle. And that if you're somewhere in the middle, then you're willing to have a conversation. You know, there might be a little more skepticism on one end, there might be a little more willing to, yeah, I see what you're talking about. But either way, there's room for conversations. And so I think we also need to remember that.
Thank you. I think some people have put their video on, which I think has indicated they have other questions. Ms. Wells or Ms. Avila? You just have to oops, I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can.
No, I
there
was
you
just
go.
asking, would it be possible to receive a copy of the slide?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll send it. I'll send it to Andrew. I can send it to you and you can share it with.
Yes, you know, I think this is like the data that you presented, especially with the San Francisco. I mean, wow. How can you have a totally different temperature in just walking a few blocks away?
The New York Times also, I think it was New York Times, looked at a number of cities where low income communities and communities of color were hotter. And they looked at a number of cities and not just, you know, that was just the San Francisco Department of Public Health put that together. But yeah, it's not uncommon. And you can, Chicago, I'm sure it's the same way. You know, you have some neighborhoods that have more vacant lots, less parks, and that makes a huge difference.
Anyone else have a question they would like to ask? Well, thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate your willingness to share your slides, because this is just great data that you've done, and the work you've done has been just we're so thankful for it, and the work you'll continue to do. All right, and just I wanted to let you know that this is being recorded also, and a recording will be available on our YouTube channel, and we will be sending that out. Asher will be when they're ready. So right now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and this is Brian Urbacheski, and he is the Director of Environmental Health Programs at Respiratory Health Association. And Asher, if you actually just want to let him bring up his slides, that would be fantastic. He works on policy, legislative, legal, and educational efforts to increase air quality, improve the lives of people who live with lung disease. He has helped author and pass state and local laws to improve air quality, engaged in efforts to improve federal air quality programs and standards, and helped direct tens of millions of dollars in funding to clean transportation projects in the Chicago area, and participated in legal and regulatory efforts that led to the closure of several highly polluting coal power plants in Illinois. RHA was founded in 1906 in Chicago and works at the local, state, and national level. Mr. Urbacheski joined RHA in 1998 and has previously worked also for the Illinois EPA. We're so happy to have you, and take it away.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I have way too many slides. They're way too detailed, and I'm going to breeze through a lot of them, but I'll be happy to share them afterwards and have people look at them, because there's just way too much information to convey here. I am going to talk more about, okay, now that we've had the pants scared off of ourselves and things are doom and gloom and there's horrible things, it's like, I'm going to talk about the first rule of holes. And the first rule of holes says, stop digging. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the policy framework going forward here, what people are doing to address climate, not so much in terms of adaptation, but in terms of like, how do we ensure that we see the least amount of warming and the least amount of disruption going forward by reducing emissions that are causing that problem. So just framing what I'm going to go through. Again, my organization's worked on air pollution issues for over 50 years. We've been around for over 100 years, but the Clean Jobs Coalition is very important in what's going on in Illinois. It's over 200 climate groups, healthcare professionals, environmental justice groups, businesses, community leaders, labor unions, faith-based organizations, student organizations, consumer advocates, way across the board, groups that were working for about a 3-year process, 2 of which were legislation being pushed in Springfield to get a big package that would address climate in Illinois, primarily from energy, the energy perspective, and a little bit of transportation. And I really want to focus on that this coalition from the beginning was really focused on equity and ensuring that lower income minority communities not only saw the greatest benefits from things like air quality going forward, but also in terms of economics. So we just passed the nation's most equitable and comprehensive climate action legislation in Illinois, passed in September. Took about 3 years of advocacy and decades of like people building power at all levels across the state. We finally got to a level where people's voices overcame the entrenched financial interests of fossil fuels. So there's a lot of different pieces to the bill that actually passed in Springfield. It's almost 1,000 pages. So there's a lot of different pieces to this. But I wanted to focus a little bit on electric transportation at the end, because that's the area where I've worked most. But jobs and economic justice, again, is up front in this. That was key. Like, not only if we're going to do this, the filter was, how is it going to affect people, and how is it going to affect communities, and how is it going to lessen inequities going forward? So there's a lot of different parts to it. We're going to talk about renewable energy, wind, solar, that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about financing and like how the money is being spent. We're going to talk a little bit about energy efficiency. We're going to talk about carbon-free power and how we're reducing fossil fuel use, transportation, and then there were a couple other little parts here, making sure there's just transitions for the communities that depend on fossil fuels right now for their economic livelihood. And there is also some stuff that I'm not really going to go into that talks about utility accountability, some grid planning, low income relief, that sort of meshes in with a lot of these other categories. So what does it mean? Illinois is supposed to have a lot of renewable power right now, and it doesn't. We're still under 10%, that first arrow there. What this bill that just passed means is we're going from the one arrow to the other arrow. So by 2030 or so, we're going to be approaching 40% renewable energy. And by 2040, we should be about 50% renewable energy in Illinois, 50% renewable power supplying our electricity. That's a lot of renewable power. I did a calculation looking at the solar panels there at the top. 14,300 megawatts doesn't mean much to the normal person, but that would cover about a fifth of the area of the city of Chicago. If you're thinking about how many solar panels that is, that's a lot. This bill increased funding, more than doubled funding for renewable energy in Illinois to about $580 million a year. There is going to be a massive build out. What does it mean in terms of like, well, if you build a lot of renewable power that doesn't produce any greenhouse gases or any smog or soot components, what are you doing with the things that do? The coal-fired power plants, the natural gas-fired power plants. And the way the bill works is that we're going to start closing a lot of coal plants. We're actually, before 2030, we're going to see about 7 more disappear. Actually, 2 are supposed to disappear this June. 1 more is supposed to disappear by September. And then there's going to be 4 more in coming years. But by 2030, all privately owned coal power plants in Illinois will be closed. There's going to be 2 municipal owned ones that will be around for a while, but they're going to have to reduce their emissions by half by 2038, and they're going to have to close by 2045. But we're going to go from what was about 2 dozen 10 years ago to about 2 fairly quickly, and then we're going to start to phase those last remaining ones out. There's also provisions to start in 2030 to start closing down the dirtiest natural gas power plants, closing them then further efforts to close them in EJ, environmental justice areas, then to close down the least efficient ones, and then phase them all out again by 2045. I mentioned a lot of communities that are going to see coal plants disappear. Those are huge amounts of their tax base, especially downstate, and it could devastate communities. So one component of this is to make sure that those coal plants that close can turn into places where you can put battery storage and a lot of solar panels in the surrounding areas to keep them as critical portions of Illinois' electrical grid. Energy efficiency is a really hard concept to grasp, but it's critical in reducing emissions going forward. We have pretty strong energy efficiency programs in Illinois. It's hard to describe all these, but it's sort of the keystone of this, or the one thing that people see is if you go to a hardware store or a Walmart or something like that, and you see light bulbs and you say like, these light bulbs are cheaper because of a ComEd program. They're discounted. That is part of Illinois' energy efficiency program. The benefit of energy efficiency is that it reduces electricity demand. So you have to run power plants less often. That lowers emissions, which is good for health and good for climate. And it also drives prices lower, because if you lower demand for something, the price also falls. So there's consumer benefits. So just to let you know that this bill actually between 2030, where current programs ended, going to 2040, it's going to increase significantly the amount of energy efficiency we expect to see. So there'll be a lot of energy saving programs, which should continue to deliver those lower emissions, better health, and more consumer benefits. So Chicago area, I think Elena covered this. I mean, it's big, it's polluted. We have a lot of industry and transportation here. We've had a chronic problem with meeting ozone problems since the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. We've had a problem, and even with the pandemic and the reduction in traffic that happened early on, while pollution was going down in a lot of other major cities because there was less traffic, in Chicago, the average daily soot concentration recorded actually went up. And soot, or fine particles, are tied to diesel engine traffic. And with the increase in Amazon warehousing and just-in-time and delivery and grocery delivery across the country, and Chicago being a hub of freight, it actually increased air pollution here. We're going to continue to have problems with air pollution over the long term here. And US EPA is actually working to tighten both of those air quality standards for ozone and fine particles over the next 2 years. So the bar is actually going to get even tighter on us, and we're going to continue to have to work even harder to meet federal air quality health standards. I think most people are familiar with this, how smog and soot are made. Think about it. It's power plants, it's factories, it's vehicles. How does it affect us? I mean, ozone is a reactive gas that burns things that it comes in contact with. So it causes swelling in the airways, which triggers a lot of lung health issues. Fine particles, very small particles that reach into the deepest portions of the lungs. They bypass a lot of the filters in the nasal passages and the mucous membranes, and can have not only breathing problems, but they cause other issues. Some of these issues we're talking about, difficulty breathing for people, but translating into asthma attacks, ER visits, hospitalizations. Fine particles are tied to more heart attacks and premature deaths as well. And that's sort of just the top of the pyramid. You have all those other effects of, people getting more sick more often, lost days from work, school, more medication needs, more doctor visits. And again, people are probably familiar with this, and they change every year, but there's a lot of people with asthma in Illinois, and as well as other lung diseases, a lot of emergency room visits, a lot of hospital
All right, so I think Brian's reconnecting, and there's a question in the chat actually that is, I think Elena Grossman can actually answer, Eric. Can you speak to the wildfire smoke impacts in the past summer in Chicago? She actually brought that up. I don't know,
Yeah.
Elena, would you mind answering that question?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, this was the first year where it wasn't necessarily only from Canada, but it was also from Washington and California, where our air quality was actually impacted, and there were air quality alerts that really targeted, those with chronic respiratory health conditions. But it actually did impact our air quality here. Years past, it hadn't necessarily affected our air quality, but this was the first year where we did see that.
Eric, do you have any other follow-up questions to that? Because I think it's helping people kind of connect the dots that this isn't, oh, here we go. But if you wanted to, like, it's helping us connect the dots that this is affecting you, but I don't know if people really get that. They still think it's, Eric, would you want to follow up to that?
Elena, I guess the question I have is like, what would you think, or what science has been proposed that made the impact different this year? Was it some type of wind variable? Was it the particular weather conditions in Chicago? I mean, I'm just kind of curious about that part.
That is a great question that I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not totally sure what the answer is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Brian, let's try again. Oh, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Here.
Sorry, it's probably good
you're
you
no
didn't hear
problem.
what I said. So let's see here. Okay, from current slide. All right. So just wanted to say, like, groups have tried to figure out like what are the impacts on certain people from air pollution, as well as other environmental pollutants. NRDC did a map that looked at all sorts of things: diesel particulates, hazardous waste facilities, cancer risk, ozone exposure, and found that there's significant burdens on the west and the south sides of Chicago. City of Chicago did something similar and looked at social vulnerability, not only where air pollution is worse, but where are people most sensitive to air pollution. And the important part of this bill is that it looks at the impact on those communities. It looks at what they call equity eligible communities, which are environmental justice communities and areas that have been harmed by violence, excessive incarceration, economic disinvestment. There's a lot of overlap with the maps that NRDC did and Chicago did and how this bill is structured. And as poverty is connected with asthma, this bill is specifically designed to look at how can you make sure that the billions of dollars that are going to be invested in a clean energy future in Illinois are spent on areas and in ways that will lessen economic inequality over time. So there's clean jobs workforce hubs to train people, pre-apprenticeship programs, programs to ensure that people coming out of incarceration are pulled into job training programs. All of these things are designed to make sure that people who suffer the most impacts from air pollution, as well as all the social vulnerability factors that make those outcomes worse, are more likely to get jobs and increase their economic situation to improve situation in those communities generally. Same thing with contractors. It's not just people getting a job, but making sure that small businesses in these communities are also given the resources they need to accelerate hiring and create economic activity. When you look at the scope of this bill, it's huge. I mean, there's $82 million a year for those equity programs, an extra $380 million a year in those renewable energy programs that have to be built. And there's also a target of 100% or 1 million electric vehicles on our roads by 2030. And I'm going to get into that a little bit. But again, the bill targets about 40% of the benefits on solar power, electric vehicles, and investments in the grid must go to these equity investment eligible communities and people. Like Elena said, diesel is a big problem. This is just a report that came out last month that shows the impact of diesel in Illinois. And as you can see, it is weighted towards the Chicago area. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists that looked at the impact in the metro Chicago area. And as you can see, the closer you get into the urban core, the more diesel pollution you see. Same thing downstate and Metro East. And certain communities, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, are more exposed to this diesel exhaust and the fine particles in it than the white population. So what's in the bill here to sort of address this? There's a big electric vehicle car rebate that's coming out in June. There's significant funding for building more electric vehicle charging stations. There is, they're hiring staff to coordinate the spending of money that's coming down the pike. And an interesting thing is there's a provision where utilities are going to spend, it's actually over $50 million a year to start, and that's going to increase every year going forward. They're supposed to electrify transportation with a focus on equity. And at least 40% of that money that the utilities are going to spend has to be spent in those equity communities. I'll skip this one. So where are things kind of now? This process of spending over $50 million a year, the Illinois Commerce Commission is overseeing it. They're doing a bunch of workshops right now. They're supposed to write a report by the end of March, which will give guidance to utilities on where and how they should spend this money. And that money should be, those plans have to be put into the state by July 1st, and they should be approved by January 1st of next year. And money should be flowing to electrify transportation equitably here in Illinois. There's also money the state has for electric vehicle rebates. Those start July 1st. There's grants to support the development of electric vehicle charging stations that are publicly available, also July 1st. And there's more stuff coming down the pike. That is just what's happening at the state level. There's also the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed Congress this past fall. There's $7.5 billion in there for electric vehicle charging. Illinois DOT is going to get at least $149 million to start just by default. We may be able to ask for even more. There's $2.5 billion for electric school buses. There's possibility of getting another $2.5 billion as well. There's an extra $39 billion in transit funding, which can support efforts like the CTA's effort to fully electrify its bus fleet by 2040. PACE also has agreed to and committed to electrify its bus fleet fully by 2040 as well. And then there's money for the electric grid modernization process. There's even money from Volkswagen. There's a settlement. Illinois has $70 million left from a lawsuit being settled that they haven't spent yet. They came up with a new plan next year. They're going to spend all that money on electrification efforts, including electric transit buses, electric school buses, and more electric car chargers. And I'll stop there. There's a lot, and I appreciate people's time. I am happy to send the full presentation because I realized I went through it at a very quick speed with a small hiccup in the middle.
Wow, thank you so much. I really appreciate you outlining these new acts that have come through and been passed. One of my concerns, and I'm happy they're doing electrical grid upgrade because, you know, how can you have an electrical car if the grid's not updated?
Right.
And that they're going to have the ability to get a, you know, rebate from the taxes. Are they doing anything to help reduce the cost of the electrical vehicles that are outside of the buses and public transportation?
Well, I mean, there is that $4,000 car rebate, which is, you know, we're still nailing down the funding stream for that. It was $4,000. It should be available for a new or used electric vehicle in Illinois. there's still some stuff going on at the federal level with the Build Back Better effort, which is in kind of limbo right now, which would increase federal rebates available for electric vehicles as well. So we at least have the state incentive nailed down, and the federal government will see what happens with that. But I think there is a big push in this general direction. But I want to make sure, we want to make sure that the money, again, for things like EV car chargers, when it is spent in those equity focused areas, because one of the things with car chargers is people who own an electric car, 90% of the time you just plug it in your garage and that's it. It fills up overnight and you have a fresh tank of gas every morning. If you're in an apartment, in an urban environment, or if you're in a condo, oftentimes you don't have that ability to plug into your own parking spot, or you don't have a parking spot. And so that's why getting those investments by the state targeted to those areas where they're needed is going to be critical to ensuring people have the ability to buy and use electric vehicles. And we're also making sure that it's not just focused on personal electric vehicles, but a significant amount of these resources are going to go to things like public vehicles going through those particular areas, garbage trucks, school buses, and city buses that people depend on.
And that's great. And I can't imagine the amount of decades of advocacy this took to get passed. It really, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we're going through a process now of actually making it work, because passing the law is actually the first step, and it's going to be about a year or two until we start to see all the pieces of this roll out. But in terms of what Elena was saying, in terms of we have a big problem, and global warming is going to cause huge problems. The first grounding is okay, how do we stop digging? And that's where this fits in. We have to eliminate those emissions that are continuing to accelerate global warming. And I'm glad that Illinois is kind of at the forefront of that.
Absolutely. What other questions do the audience have for either of the speakers? And if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself, you can also put them into the chat. Whichever way will work well. What about CTA, and have they committed like PACE has, or not quite yet?
CTA was actually the first. They committed by 2040 to fully electrify their bus fleet of over 1,800 vehicles. And there should be a report coming out soon, very soon. It was supposed to be out at the end of the month, on how exactly CTA is going to do that. So there should be some stories in the news soon about what CTA's actual plan is, how long it's going to take, how they're going to phase it in. And just this fall, based on pressure from a lot of community groups and what CTA did being out there, PACE decided that they were going to commit to that 2040 date as well for their approximately 900 buses that they have.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think that'll very much help things within Chicago. I was kind of not happy about seeing that 1970s onward until today, we're actually not meeting standards. In the pandemic, we were much worse. I mean, so I'm glad to hear CTA is committed, but what about Chicago itself? And I know there's an ongoing plan update that Elena told us about, but what is Chicago specifically going to actively do with these new Illinois regulations in their plan to address this glaring problem?
Not totally sure how it's, the plan is not finalized. I'm not sure how it's connected to CEJA. And that's not to say that it's not, I just don't know, but they are being very deliberate in paying attention to equity as well. And, they're thinking about everything from business buildings to high occupancy, residential buildings, to low occupancy residential buildings, and where to prioritize and what aspects of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions should they prioritize. And that's actually what the survey does go into. So, they're trying to make it as informed by the community as possible. And again, it's not finalized, but they are having these conversations, as well as, the addressing CTA and CPS, but also understanding that they're also separate agencies, like they're not all under the mayor's office. So some complications, but trying to work it out.
Well, that's great to hear, and I look forward to hearing what comes out of that climate change agreement from Chicago. There is a question in the chat about how how are basically air quality monitors in Chicago metropolitan area positioned, and how many are there?
I could tackle that. Not well. There are very few. I mean, they're very expensive because they're regulatory grade. They're very accurate, and they require a lot of tweaking and calibration. So they are far and few between. You can go 3, 4, 5 miles in the city between monitors, and even further apart in the suburbs, 10 miles apart. And that's just, again, a function of cost. There are some interesting things going on though. And there's one thing people can look up. It's called it's Microsoft's Project Eclipse, just like the sun and the moon, where they have used much cheaper, lower cost, smaller monitoring devices, and they put them on CTA bus shelters, over 100 of them around Chicago. And it's an interesting thing where it's a real time, you can see, all those 100 at the same time on a map, and what they're recording. And you can often see, like you can see a fire, or you could see where there are individual problems of, a lot of traffic that pop up on those monitors.
I'm literally Googling it now. I'm trying to figure that out. I'll look at it in a little bit. Anyone have any other questions? These are great. Can you speak to the plans downstate? This is huge, because I think the I don't remember who pointed out, but the reliance on the coal plants from employment standpoints, I mean, it is a huge concern.
Yeah, and it's, it is coal country. There's a big historical, cultural connection with coal in Southern Illinois. They've mined it for 150 years down there, and it's a huge portion of the economy. And as it disappears, it does cause a lot of social dislocations. People lose jobs, communities lose tax base. And so this bill, with its focus on equity, wasn't just focused on, people living in inner city Chicago who happen to be feeling the impacts from global warming and the pollutants, but also making sure that, we're not destroying the fabric of Southern Illinois, and providing them funding to get more investments there, to get job training, and to rebuild the economy and transition it away from fossil fuels in a rational way.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate you both having your emails in the chat and be willing to share the slides. A recording of today will also be available on the CAC website. We would encourage you to join. And if you please, just don't mind looking in the chat. There's a form to evaluate today's webinar. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Elena, so much for sharing your expertise today. It's just been really great to hear both of your views and the information, and hearing more about these recently passed acts is giving us a lot of hope. So thank you for attending today. And thank you to everyone for spending their lunch hour with us. I really appreciate your time and energy in trying to learn more about this critical topic of climate change and how it affects our asthma, as well as how we're working, and some of us very, very admirably for decades, on advocating for the changes that we've heard about today. So thank you so much, everyone.